All right, let's go ahead and start. All right, everybody. Today on the Kingpin Cast, episode 5, we have guest Mac Haddow of the American Kratom Association, the most influential helper, the most influential organization that is going to help us keep Kratom legal, y'all. How are you doing today, Mac?
I'm doing great. It's great to be with you.
Thank you for joining me. I certainly appreciate it. I'm an old pain pill addict, and my story is I was eating handfuls of pain pills every day so much that I was getting sick, was throwing up all over the place. My life was a living hell. And then one day I found kratom, and since that day, my life has changed. I mean, I'm just thankful for so much, and the whole kratom community is very supportive. And Mac, I appreciate what you do. What is your story, sir? How'd you get started with kratom?
Well, actually, I've been involved in the dietary supplement and vitamin business for a long time here
Right.
in Washington, D.C. as a lobbyist.
Yeah.
I started out back in the mid 80s, actually the early 80s,
Hmm.
as the chief of staff of the Department of Health and Human Services. And in that role, I got to see firsthand the way that the FDA deals with issues where they want to have concentrated regulatory powers.
Right.
And it was a constant struggle then. In the early 90s, they made their power play that they had been building for about a decade, where they wanted to control all dietary supplements and vitamins. And interestingly, they used the same tactics then that they're using now on kratom. They painted the dietary supplements as dangerous,
Hmm.
that they were killing people, that there were all kinds of adverse events. And the very same thing was true in the early 90s as is true today with kratom, and that is that there are some bad actors in the industry that were adulterating their products and
Yes.
producing
Yes.
dangerous products.
I heard
Uh,
about that, like the Phenibut.
and at the end of the day, the FDA overplayed their hand, and you had for the first time in the history of the U.S. Capitol, the pro dietary supplement consumers actually shut down the U.S. Capitol switchboard with the number of calls that they were making. Now, that we didn't have emails in those days that were at least
Right.
used by the common, there were some business emails, but they really wasn't popular among individuals. And so the main way of communicating with Congress were phone calls or letters. And
Right.
both phone calls and letters pummeled the FDA and the Congress. And the result was that Congress unanimously passed the DSHEA Act, which is the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act. And
Right.
that bill set the framework for the way that vendors could get dietary supplements approved. The interesting part of it was that they set a deadline for all existing products that were on the market, which was October 15th of 1994. Now, we all know that kratom has been used in the United States since the early 70s, when it became very prevalent. As our Vietnam soldiers were coming home, they had used it in the midst of those long days in the jungle that they had needed an energy boost, and they got it by chewing kratom leaves.
Yeah.
And they wanted to have that benefit of a natural leaf product, and so they had people send it to them. And then there was a dramatic expansion in the Hmong population immigrating into the United States in the early 70s, and so we saw a lot of ethnic delis pop up
Right.
where they were selling kratom products. But the problem is that the FDA takes the position that the only documentation that they will accept for the grandfathering of kratom products is a software trail, in other words, document of the transaction. And we have searched high and low. Of course, in those days, you didn't have, particularly with mom and pop ethnic delis, didn't have
Yeah.
any kind of transactional record that was
Yeah. No
created
paper
by.
trails.
Right. And they refused to accept, even though there was a precedent setting court case that indicated they were supposed to, they won't accept global documentation either, because the whole purpose of the DSHEA Act was to allow for those products that were generally recognized as safe, defined as having been in commerce, and there were no major health problems as a result of them. But the FDA has been resolute in denying kratom access to that. So we get to 2009, which was, I think, the triggering event when you saw the cluster of 9 deaths in Sweden that were attributed to the consumption of a powdered kratom product sold on the internet called Krypton. There is no question that when you get a cluster of 9 deaths in a 12-month period from a single product, that is of legitimate concern to anyone, any
Of
health
course,
official
yes.
in the world. And so the FDA started their war on kratom as soon as they saw that report, and they started disseminating their disinformation campaign throughout the United States. They sucked the DEA into it because we saw the DEA started to list kratom as a
Yep.
drug of concern. They did the same thing with NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse. They had everybody believing it. They had states. You had 6 states between 2012, when they implemented their first import alert on kratom,
I remember
and
that.
2016. You had 6 states that got sucked into this disinformation campaign, and they enacted bans. But that wasn't good enough for the FDA, because what they wanted is a total outright ban. And so they proposed on August the 31st of 2016, the publication in the Federal Register by the Drug Enforcement Administration was that the 2 alkaloids in kratom would be scheduled as Schedule 1 substances.
Right.
And the argument that the FDA made was that the danger to the public was so significant that they used the emergency power section of the Controlled Substances Act in order to get that scheduling done. The Drug Enforcement Administration accepted it. Now, the interesting thing about that is that that section of the law had been used 82 prior times always in order to get street drugs off the streets that were those concoctions that were made that were killing people. That was the purpose of that section. And so you had to prove as one of the conditions that the safety factor included these deaths that were occurring in real time. What the FDA produced to the DEA in 2016 was a record of 33 deaths over a 5-year period globally. They could not even come up with the exigent circumstance that was required by that section of the statute, showing that there was an imminent danger to the American public. They couldn't come up with the number of deaths that would be in any way determined by any reasonable public health official as being a significant health hazard. They stretched, and when I say stretched, when you look at the data that we finally were able to extract from them,
Yeah.
justifying those 33 deaths, which they then subsequently increased to 44 deaths when they made their second application. But in 2016, I was called by the American Kratom Association and asked if I'd be willing to help. I told them honestly that there was very little chance that there would be a rescission or a withdrawal of that application by the FDA because it had been accepted by the DEA.
Right.
And in 82 prior attempts, every one of them had been ratified and published, and every one of those 82 substances were designated as Schedule 1 products that were removed from the marketplace. But the only opportunity that we really had, in my judgment, was to create enough of a public record that would demonstrate that the FDA was wrong on the science and they were wrong on the policy. So we recruited and just put the word out. We ended up landing the interest of one of the preeminent scientists in the world on addiction liability, and that was Dr. Jack Hennifield. Jack had spent his 13 or 14 years at the National Institute on Drug Abuse doing exactly the analysis that he volunteered to do at no cost. It was pro bono work where he volunteered to do the full 8-factor analysis, which is the record that shows all of the scientific information that would justify a scheduling procedure. He looked at each one analytically, not with the biased lens that the FDA used, but rather to determine whether or not these substances, these alkaloids, ought to be subject to a scheduling order. Right. His conclusion was that they could be, but they shouldn't be. Now, when I say could be, I mean, there are many substances that are currently on the market today that could be scheduled as Schedule 1 substances, right. But because when you balance the equities, meaning that you balance the safety factor, the risks associated with it, and the benefits of those substances, caffeine's a perfect example. We see caffeine deaths every year, and if the DEA were to take the orthodox view that the FDA was asking with respect to kratom, they would ban caffeine. They don't, because they recognize that caffeine has an alerting function. It gives people an energy boost, and it helps them to focus. And so when it's used responsibly, it is not dangerous. And they also recognize that it's only when it's concentrated into a formulation or a form of the substance that it can become dangerous. And they have banned, the FDA has banned concentrated caffeine tablets because they were killing people. They could do the same thing with kratom. So Jack Henningfield said, look, I'll do the analysis. The interesting thing was, and it surprised me, and I know, and Jack told the AKA the same thing, no chance that you're going to reverse the DEA's position. They've never done it before. The only chance you have is to build this record from a scientific standpoint to demonstrate when you take them to court that the analysis was flawed. And so that was our strategy going in. An interesting thing happened. Even though under the emergency scheduling provisions of the Controlled Substances Act that was used by the DEA at that time, there was no comment period allowed. There were about 6,000 or more people who commented over the threshold of the DEA and started making phone calls. I remember that the public affairs officer at the DEA had a conversation with Vernon Jones, the Georgia representative who ultimately became the sponsor of the Georgia Kratom Consumer Protection Act. He told Vernon, he said, we didn't know what kratom was, never heard of it, but our phones are ringing off the hook with people that are saying it has saved their lives. And that message got through. And so and then in addition, there were 51 members of the U.S. House of Representatives, 25 Democrats and 26 Republicans, led by Matt Salmon from Arizona, who's now left the Congress, and Congressman Mark Pocan from Wisconsin, who currently is in the Congress. And we'll talk about it a little later here in this program because he's the primary sponsor of the federal Kratom Consumer Protection Act that will be filed shortly in the Congress. So those two members worked together, got a bipartisan letter sent that said, do not schedule kratom. It should not be scheduled. And on the Senate side, we had two letters, 9 senators on one letter, and then 3 on another, the composite of 13 individual separate senators signing a letter to the DEA saying, do not ban kratom, do not schedule it. And to give you an idea, we had a balance of 25 Dems and 26 Republicans on the House side. We had on the Senate side the philosophical divide between Senator Orrin Hatch, who was arguably one of the most conservative members of the United States Senate at the time, and Senator Bernie Sanders. Now, those two couldn't be farther apart philosophically, but both saw that this was an overreach by the FDA, that the premise upon which the argument was being made was flawed, and that they believed that this was a product that should be available to people because of the potential benefits that it offered in terms of opioid use as an alternative for people to use to manage chronic and acute pain. So the startling thing that happened in mid-October was that the DEA withdrew, first time in 82 previous attempts. They withdrew it on the 83rd attempt, and they said to the FDA, we're going to withdraw the scheduling, and we want you, the FDA, to produce the full 8-factor analysis, which is a complete rulemaking document, which documents the claims that were made by the FDA, and we want it by December 1st. And then they opened up a formal public comment period. 23,232 consumers wrote to the DEA. 99.1% of them were against the ban. And you had a range of people, professionals, you had law enforcement officials, you had scientists, you had physicians, and you had average consumers of kratom, all who unitedly delivered the message that it was not appropriate to schedule kratom. The December 1st deadline came, and Jack Henningfield produced a day early his full 8-factor analysis with his expertise and credibility, and the FDA sat silent. They didn't do anything. And so the DEA stood down, and it wasn't until October 17th of 2017, a year later, that the FDA finally produced its 8-factor analysis. And of course, they renewed their claims that kratom is an opioid, and therefore it is highly addictive, that it has an addiction liability that draws people into an addiction profile and dependency that is dangerous. They claimed that they had now reviewed the records and found that there were 44 deaths associated with the use of kratom. And they argued
the guy that got gunshot to the chest, they claimed him.
Yeah, well, and so we didn't know at the time exactly how bad their data was, but you're absolutely right. And so they produced this document, and the DEA then said, okay, we're going to take a look at it. In the February of 2018, then FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb went on national TV and said that he was issuing a consumer alert saying that kratom was an opioid, that it killed the 44 people, and this is the interesting thing that they did. They claimed that they had developed a novel computer analytical tool that was that absolutely and conclusively proved that kratom, the alkaloids in kratom, bind to the mu opioid receptor in the brain. You know what? He was right. But the conclusion that they drew from this analytical tool that they had developed, and they admitted it was novel, was only that they could prove with a computer model that it binds to it, but it had nothing to do with whether or not kratom had the same opioid effects or opioid-like effects, which Dr. Gottlieb was claiming that it had, which means that because it binds to the mu opioid receptor, it therefore must also produce the same respiratory suppression effects as classic opioids. Now, a couple of points on that. First off, there are many substances that hit the mu opioid receptor that do not have any impact on the respiratory system, kratom among them. An example is that the noxolone, which is the antidote to an opioid overdose, which obviously does not hit the respiratory suppression system. It actually alerts the patient, brings them back. That binds to the opioid receptor, the mu opioid receptor in the brain. There are many, St. John's wort, there's a whole list of them. And by the way, cheese is among them. When there's been a peer-reviewed published study that looked at the food and why people enjoy eating cheese and why pizza, for example, is so popular, they found that the chemicals that are in the cheese, the equivalent alkaloids that are in kratom, that produces, because it hits the mu opioid receptor, produces this pleasure and activates the pleasure center in your brain, so you enjoy eating that. And so the point is that there are many substances that hit the same mu opioid receptor that do not have the impact on the respiratory system. And in a very technical term, and the scientists have documented this, and they've done it since the early 90s, they've known that there was a binding effect of the alkaloids of kratom, but they hit what's called the G protein arrestor, and it simply is a way station where it diverts the impacts of the alkaloids away from the respiratory system. So the claim that the FDA was attempting to make, was simply not true. It was not scientifically justified, and they could dress it up any way that they wanted. The other thing that Commissioner Gottlieb said in February of 2018 was that they now had conclusively proved that they had these 44 deaths. Now, there was one, they admitted that there was polydrug use, and they admitted that there were adulterated products associated with this, but there was one death they pointed out that was kratom only. And Dr. Gottlieb said, this is the one that interests us the most. And he pledged to provide the data. Now, this is the interesting thing about that. First off, 44 deaths globally is not a justification scientifically for the scheduling of any substance.
I agree.
Every death is tragic. But when you look at the prior scheduling orders that have been issued by the DEA, they don't do it in what is a statistically insignificant data set with respect to safety. The FDA was hyping it. They were making it sound like it was far more deadly than it actually is. And so they knew they were in trouble on the mu opioid receptor issue. So then the question became, is it really that deadly? And so we FOIA'd all of the medical records of all 44 of those deaths. And we had an independent researcher who's a PhD in toxicology, Dr. Jane Babin, also an attorney, to look at it. And she went through methodically and analyzed each one of those records. And with the exception of the one where there are no medical records available, which Dr. Gottlieb had cited as being his ace card, that was going to be the one that proved it was kratom only. He was going to be able to nail us with that. She found that the 43 deaths were all polydrug use or adulterated kratom products that had deadly narcotics in them that killed the individuals that were cited by the FDA. Now, we're not saying that kratom is absolutely 100% safe. You can overdose on any substance. I mean, there are examples where people have overdosed on water. Obviously, we look at responsible use, right? So this is the key factor when you look at scheduling, and it's a question of whether or not there is an addiction liability to the product. That's one important criteria. You also look at what the effects in terms of the respiratory system that would cause a death. That's another very important factor. So when you put all of this together, the question is whether or not the FDA's claims were justified. And we found that they weren't. So what Jane Babin's report showed was that the FDA was pulling data that was not just suspect, it was laughable in some cases. We saw a young man who had suffered from bipolar disorder his entire life, who had been released from a mental institution the week before, who then a week later hung himself. And when he hung himself, he had a number of illegal substances and some prescription drugs in his system. Well, not only polydrug use, but also contraindicated. So he was taking a mix of drugs that his physician was not aware of, and that obviously created some problems. And then he also was taking kratom, which, by the way, isn't surprising when you look at the profile of kratom consumers who are attempting to wean off of opioids or to replace opioids in terms of managing their acute and chronic pain. So it's not surprising that you would find in some deaths kratom detected in the system. Not that it's a cause of the death, and in this case, certainly in any of these cases, it was not. But this young man hung himself because he had a mental condition that, as tragic as it was not caused. His death wasn't caused. He didn't hang himself because he was taking kratom. In fact, he probably was trying to alleviate some of the mental health issues and the pain that he was suffering from by using kratom. It wasn't the cause. I'm doing great. There's another example that was pulled out of Germany where a man at a party jumped out of a window, broke his arm, suffered severe internal injuries, refused medical treatment, went up to his bedroom and died a couple of hours later. Now, he didn't die from kratom. He died from the internal bleeding that was going on from the fall that he sustained. And when they tested him, I think he had 9 illicit substances in his system. So you look at that and you say, wow, how could the FDA do this? Now, here's another interesting one. And by the way, all of these reports were taken from the FAERS database, which is the FDA's adverse event reporting system.
Right.
Well, you actually, as a consumer, I've been involved in the dietary supplement or vitamin business or a first responder, were to see or observe something I suspect, you would then submit it to the FAERS database. Actually, the FDA makes a big deal that when you go to the FAERS database as an individual citizen, they tell you do not think that this has been verified. Any of this information deals with issues. It is not where they want to investigate or concentrated, don't trust regulatory powers. The basis upon which any decision will then be made about whether in the early 90s they made their power play actually caused the building. They make a big deal about that, where they wanted to control all they did exactly dietary supplements and vitamins. They used that FAERS database, which was obviously then that they're using now on kratom. So they painted the dietary supplements as dangerous, criminal. So you have to assume that they just decided that there were all kinds of adverse events. Anywhere kratom showed up, and the very same thing was true in the early 90s as is true today with kratom. They cited a report. There are some peer-reviewed published report that had a headline, and I'm paraphrasing this headline, that were adulterating their products, effects of the dose level of mitragynine in the blood system of deceased individuals. And at the end of the day, that they looked at overplayed their hand, and what they were trying to determine in the history was the death caused by this individual at a low dose of pro-dietary supplement or at a high level actually shut down the U.S. Capital progeny with the number in the blood systems. And their conclusion, and obviously we didn't have emails, they just looked at the headlines, all 2 deaths associated with the use of there were some business emails, but there really wasn't popular among individuals. And so the signed way of communicating with Congress of the document that the FDA was using, and they both submitted and letters to the DEA, was in essence a Congress. And the result was the Congress unanimously passed. That was 2 of them. And then, of course, the most famous one, the Shea Act, which is the Dietary Supplement Health Education Act. We asked and that bill document set the framework for autopsy way that almost vendors could get. We had enough information to know the interesting first name of the individual, the date of birth. They set a deadline for because it looked like literally products that were on the market, which was October 15th of 1994. Hillary Clinton email. Now we all know everything has been used in the United States, and so that was an August. And when we asked, they said, "Oh, it's a HIPAA." Became very prevalent, which means that as our Vietnam soldiers were coming home, they used it, and their claim in the midst of those long days in the jungle that they needed an energy boost. That's what they told us. And they got it by chewing kratom leaves and being able to get these. And they wanted to have that benefit of getting a natural leaf product. And so they had people send it to them. And then there was a dramatic expansion in the Hmong population in another database immigrating into the United States that was completely under the early 70s. And what so we saw a lot of ethnic delis that individual had where there was a number of illegal drugs. But the problem is that the FDA takes the position that the only documentation that they will accept from two grandfathering of kratom products is a software trail. And what the FDA wanted, they wanted to impose a privacy restriction to help them, not the family. We have searched high and low, of course, in those days, nor the DEA or anyone else to know, particularly they were citing a death that they were attributing to ethnic delis, didn't have any actual use of kratom, when in fact it was 2 gunshot wounds to the chest. They refused to accept, even though there was off the reservation visa case, the FDA they were supposed to. Analytical, they won't accept global. They would submit something because the whole purpose of the DSHEA part of a major public policy those products that, and I think that accounts for why the DEA defined as having been in seconds, and there were no major health problems as a result of the second submission. But the FDA has been resolute in denying kratom access. The National Institute on Drug Abuse were alarmed enough, which was, I think, the report triggering event. They did their own independent analysis of 9 deaths in Sweden those deaths that were attributed to the published on their website on September 20th, 2018, sold on the internet called kratom. All of the deaths there is no cited by the FDA were either polydrug abuse from a single product, that is of legitimate concern. It was only one the FDA had decided as being of critical importance, and so the FDA started no medical records were available as soon as they saw that the FDA and they started promised would be the ace hole for him. He would the ace card. He was going to be able to prove that kratom kills people. Yeah. We FOIA'd the FDA every month for a year and several months, and finally they admitted to us that there was no medical record that was available. They were relying upon a family report of either a mother or father who said that their son was using only kratom, but yet there was no medical records that were available to support that claim. So it was not true. So again, even if it were unfortunately true, you would have a situation where it's not statistically significant. Now, the Centers for Disease Control did do their own study, and they found that there were 150 some deaths that had kratom detected in the bloodstream. They identified 91 of those deaths where it was the kratom was listed by the medical examiner and coroners around the country as being a kratom associated death. Now, that's important. And that got our attention. Now, I should tell you as a sidebar to this, that after that report was published, we received at the AK, we received a call from a medical examiner in a county in Idaho who reported to us that he had had a death. It was a drug overdose. It was from a specific polydrug use problem, and kratom was detected in the system, and he submitted it as a drug overdose that was caused by the specific drugs that he listed on the death report. He said he got a call from the FDA. And the FDA said, you've got to change that result, that conclusion, and make it a kratom-associated death. And he said, why would I do that? It's not true. Science doesn't support it. And he said the FDA kept pressuring me, finally hung up on them. And he reported to us because what he told us was that he suspected that the FDA was aggressively trying to get medical examiners and coroners around the country to do that. And so you have an artificially inflated data set that is being triggered by FDA, inappropriate, by the way, FDA intervention in the medical conclusions of the medical examiners and coroners around the country. But the CDC report concluded that of the 91 deaths, and they went through and they tiered them, that they were all polydrug use, except for 7. And they listed the drugs as a percentage of the number of deaths that were reported, which drugs were actually, and fentanyl was the top one, and heroin and morphine that went down the list. But they said there were 7 that were, in fact, that they could not rule out that kratom was the only substance involved. So they looked at those 7, and the headline doesn't support this in the CDC report, by the way, but when you look at the report itself, those 7 actually, when they did a more sophisticated look at the blood sampling, with the exception of one where the blood wasn't sufficient to do it, that 6 of those 7 actually were caused by polydrug use, but the medical examiner coroners weren't using the most modern or up-to-date and analytical equipment. And again, they're resource poor. It's more expensive equipment. But they found that, in fact, there was no basis to conclude in any of those deaths, with the exception of one for no blood work, was available.
Mm-hmm.
We think it's the same one, by the way, that the FDA was looking at.
Wow.
That in fact it was polydrug use or adulterated kratom products. So there's not on the public record today, as we talk, right at this minute, there isn't a justifiable conclusion that anyone can make that kratom kills anyone. It can be abused. There's no question about that. Someone can overdose on virtually anything, and I would suspect kratom is one of those substances they could if they were to abuse it. And we know that if you are in the grasp of an opioid addiction, that your brain gets remapped, and so you tend to have a behavior as you wean off of opioids where you use things in excess, and it is possible that you could harm yourself with any substance, and in this case, it might be true for kratom. But the science hasn't proven that to be a significant event at this point, and certainly there's no. If the FDA were able to point at any death, anyone, anywhere in the country, perhaps even in the world, that was kratom only, they would be shouting it to the rooftops. They can't do it because those deaths don't exist. So the question is it a legitimate health issues and the pain and the decision for the DEA to say that kratom is killing people? It's not. So then they have to rely upon whether it has opioid-like effects. That would mean, does it impact the respiratory system? We know it doesn't. The science proves that. A lot of peer-reviewed published articles that completely refute the FDA's claim that it has opioid-like effects. It does not. Then they have to prove that it has an addiction liability that leads people into an addiction that is dangerous. The National Institute on Drug Abuse did 2 animal studies. And by the way, animal studies are the gold standard for determining whether or not any substance, even if it's a controlled substance or a drug that's approved by the FDA, they use animal studies to determine the addiction liability.
Right.
So the FDA funded 2 independent, running concurrently because they wanted to get the answer quickly as they could. They funded 2 independent animal studies. The first was published in August of 2018. I'm sorry, in June of 2018,
Right.
and it was the HIMBY study. They concluded, their words, there is no addiction liability to the use of kratom. And then they reported that in the test animals, they observed that there was in fact a reduction in the cravings for morphine, which was the reference drug. So the test animals were actually looking to metrogenine more than they were to the morphine to handle their pain.
Yes.
That was an astounding result, and which is why the NIDA people did the next thing they did, which was to fund more research into kratom. The second study was published 2 weeks later in July of 2018. It's called the U study, and they found the same thing. Now, the wording that they used about the addiction liability said it has no significant addiction liability, made the same observation about the potential for kratom to be a alternative pain relief to a highly addictive and obviously very dangerous opioid products. So that's why NIDA did the investment of our tax money into research that today out in the field we're told there's as much as $15 million in research. In the FY 2020 appropriations budgeting bill that was passed by the U.S. Congress, there was a specific directive to increase that funding, including some clinical trial work to be done by another agency at HHS. And they specifically, in the language of the bill, noted that there were people who were reporting that they were able to wean off of opioid addictions by using kratom. And so the Congress is very interested in this. The National Institute on Drug Abuse Director Nora Volkow testified before the House Appropriations Committee, and when asked the question directly, do you think kratom should be scheduled, she said no, because a ban would create more problems for the research that they think is needed, and obviously that was called for by the 2 studies that they had funded, which said that there should be more studies into the potential for kratom to be used as that non-addictive alternative to pain management for those afflicted with acute and chronic pain. So we are today in a situation, in a stalemate with the FDA that is of their own making. They continue to insist that kratom should be, in fact, scheduled. And there is no basis for that to be on the scientific record using the criteria that's applied by the Controlled Substances Act. There is no legitimate basis upon which they can make that claim. That's
the
DEA has
for 1 second?
Sure.
I'm sorry to interrupt, sir, but
That's right.
what I think is, I want to say put your tinfoil hat if you want to, put it on, but the FDA and Big Pharma is in bed together, and they just don't want something taken away from their patients.
Well, I
That
think there's a
it's
combination of
money.
factors. Yeah, I think there's a combination of factors. One is the inherent bias at the FDA by the group of scientists that look at dietary supplements. They do
Uh-huh.
not like dietary supplements.
Right.
They
They don't.
it took the FDA 10 years to implement the Shea Act because they didn't like the bill. They thumbed their nose at Congress for 10 years on the premise that in that 10-year period, their claim that they made prior to the passage of the bill is that people would be dropping in the streets from bad dietary supplement products. They
Yep.
wanted the dietary supplement industry to implode on itself. So that's one factor, and that bias continues today. You
Yes.
see it when a kratom product is submitted for a new dietary ingredient application. It is routinely denied, not because the evidence isn't there that the kratom product is safe and as it's formulated. It's because of the bias that the FDA has. The second factor, and I don't think it's one you can ignore anymore, and that is that the FDA today is reliant in a significant amount of their funding from the pharmaceutical industry
Yes, they do.
because we passed the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. And at the time that the PDUFA, it's called the PDUFA Act,
Hmm.
was passed, in the first year, about 9% of their overall funding for the FDA was in the new drug application process. The fees that were associated with that comes from the industry. So
Yeah.
you say, okay, well that's good because the deal that was struck with PDUFA was that the pharmaceutical manufacturers are saying that the FDA was slowing down the review of these new therapies, and there were some breakthrough therapies that needed to be approved that were being slowed down because the FDA couldn't do it. The FDA came back and said, we don't have the resources, don't have the personnel, don't have the equipment. We simply can't turn these things out. And so the agreement was made that if the industry were to fund the new drug application process and the resources needed for that, then they would turn around a review in a specific time period. And so that was the grand compromise. Today, PDUFA funds nearly 50% of the agency's revenues in a multi-billion-dollar budget. And within the new drug approval process, it's 68% of the funding for that process. So if anyone wants with a straight face to say money doesn't matter in this system, they're simply wrong. It doesn't pass the smell test. The FDA is obviously hooked on the money. They're addicted
Yeah,
to it.
they are.
And so you look at the dietary supplement industry and you look at kratom, there's not going to be a penny that rolls across the transom at the FDA in asking them to simply do their job, which they're required to do. Their
Yeah.
bias against dietary supplements continues to persist. The monetary bias continues to exist. And it's really going to take some kind of congressional action to fix that problem because we're not going to get it from the FDA, even though we would like to believe that we can trust the FDA. Every American does it. I run into this problem when we talk to state legislators and to county supervisors. They say, well, the FDA said it. So, and the unspoken part is, therefore, it must be true. And
Yeah.
that simply is ridiculous because the
We
FDA,
can't trust them.
they're thugs in this arena when
Yeah.
it comes to the proper implementation of a good public policy with respect to kratom to protect the American public. They sit by and allow people to die because they don't interdict adulterated kratom products, and the evidence is there. Their own evidence points to them. They know there are people dying. And it's because they refuse to step in and regulate kratom the way they should, the way the law says they should. And they say, no, we wanted to have it scheduled and removed from the marketplace entirely. They didn't do that with Tylenol. They didn't do it with they don't do it with lettuce when they say that there's a salmonella infection. They simply clean up the problem. They
Yeah.
address where the contaminant comes in or where the adulterant comes in, and they simply get after that problem, not with kratom. The FDA is so biased, so off the reservation on this, it's not even funny. They need to be reined in, and that's what we hope to do here in the near term with some legislation.
Speaking of that legislation, I believe we were going to go over two new bills at a federal level that are being worked on that will definitely help out all of us kratom consumers, the millions of us in the United States.
We are. One of the things that we've been able to do because of the generous support of the kratom consumers in the United States is to work hard with a lot of resources to develop a framework for a federal Kratom Consumer Protection Act. Now, we know we've been very successful at the state level with the same regulatory scheme that allows for the states to do what the FDA should be doing. But at the federal level, we've got a couple of unique problems. The first is that there needs to be more scientific research on what we know, and if it was directly, we know what will be done. So one of the bills that is going to be a part of a 2-bill package that will be filed in the next 30 days that Congressman Pocan is working on the House side, and we're developing some Senate sponsors so we get concurrent filing, will increase the research into kratom specifically for the uses that people are very successfully finding that can be used. When you look at the most recent study that was done by of the kratom consumer population by Johns Hopkins University, they found that nearly half of the people that consume kratom use it to manage pain, and of those, they found a significant number who are able to wean off of opioids within a year. It is an astounding number, and if we can do that and take people out of into a less dangerous environment, and that's what the American healthcare system is about, is harm reduction. If we can remove people from a very dangerous environment with highly addictive and potentially deadly opioids, and we know that the overdose deaths are a public health crisis that's even greater than the COVID crisis that we're experiencing right now. We simply need to apply the resources to it. So that kind of research will be very important. So that's one bill. The second bill addresses a couple of issues that the FDA right now holds all the cards on because the Congress gave them the statutory authority to do it, and we simply need to fix that. The first is the import alert that was first imposed by the FDA on all kratom coming into the United States, that was imposed first in 2012 and through a couple of iterations continues to today. So when kratom comes into the United States, and there's a significant amount of it, 1,950 metric tons a month comes in order to serve 15 million American consumers of kratom. The reason that happens is the import alert was never designed to be what the FDA has tried to make it into, which is million American consumers of kratom. Entire product class in the raw materials that are used to actually produce kratom. What the import alert was designed to do was to target an individual exporter in a country where the product was absolutely contaminated and interdict the importer here in the United States. Never was supposed to be a blanket, and yet that's what the FDA has converted through an regulatory expansion of the statutory authority, which they don't have the right to do, but they've done it. They've usurped it, and the Congress has allowed them to get away with it. So we fixed that in this Kratom Consumer Protection Act at the federal level, which will restrict their ability to impose an import alert, and they can only do it for those products that they can document have an illegal substance that has been adulterated into the kratom raw material. So that's an important step that we want to take. The second thing that the Kratom Consumer Protection Act at the federal level will do is to say that we will suspend the portion of the DSHEA Act, which the FDA is now using as the tourniquet to stop any legitimate approvals, and it will allow for kratom to be marketed in the United States as a dietary ingredient. And so we will open up the import alert so that we can get pure kratom into the United States, and then we'll suspend their authority that they're abusing right now in order to make it into safe products. Then the law would require within 1 year, the FDA will have to produce the regulatory guidelines with public meetings that will mirror what a dietary supplement manufacturing regimen should be. So with clarity, we'll now know what everybody has to do in order to produce safe products. And they, of course, will have oversight during that time period by the Congress. So that bill will do exactly what they should be doing now that we've asked the states to do. And we will be asking the kratom consumer public to, in the next month, to mobilize and to convince their individual members of Congress and senators to support and sign on as co-sponsors of this bill so that we can send a powerful message to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration that their time is up for the lies, their disinformation, and their abuse of their regulatory powers. that we're going to rein them in, and we're going to do what's right in the midst of this opioid epidemic to allow for and empower consumers to make decisions about a safer product that will reduce the harm. And that's our goal. And I know that that there are some people who say in the kratom community, and it's unfortunate, but it's a free country. They say what they want. That they think that, oh, well, the AK is just out there trying to strong arm people to give them money. The product of every donation that is made to the American Kratom Association comes when you see the successes that we have in the States. And but for this COVID-19 situation, we would have over a dozen states that would have passed the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, which was a critical milestone for us. We're going to pick that battle up as soon as the legislatures get back in session. Many of them have adjourned for the year, so we'll have to start the battle again in January. So we got set back a little bit, but the message is still clear. When you look at the number, the votes, and we saw it last year when in Utah it was 25 or 24-1 in the Utah State Senate. It was 164-1 in the Georgia House and unanimous in the Georgia Senate. It was unanimous in both House and Senate in the Arizona legislature. It was unanimous in the Nevada State Senate, and it was 39-14, I believe the number was, in the House. And that was only because a doctor stood up that's a member of the legislature in Nevada and read from the FDA talking points about kratom and tried to scare people off, and that didn't work. In the state of Missouri, we had a 100 and I should get the numbers right, but I think it was 119-6, something like that. In the Oklahoma House, it was unanimous. In the New Hampshire Senate, I think it was unanimous, the passage of it. When we were fighting the battle in New Hampshire, where the sponsor had come in with a kratom bill instigated by the disinformation by the FDA, when we showed him exactly what the right framework, regulatory framework was, the Senate committee, the Health Committee, passed it out unanimously, and we know, and the Senate passed it unanimously. So we think we're going to have good success there when they reconvene. We saw in Mississippi that there were 3 kratom ban bills, and when we went to the Senate Drug Policy Committee, it was an interesting procedure they used in Mississippi. The bills referred to 2 committees, the Senate Judiciary Committee and the Senate Drug Policy Committee. First one was the Drug Policy Committee. We went in and showed them the science, and it was unanimous to reject the ban and replace it with the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. When we went to the Judiciary Committee, the local Mississippi Medical Association and a drug task force that's been spreading the FDA disinformation around that state stepped in, and so the legislature said, okay, we're not doing anything until next year. Now there's a possibility when they reconvene that they're going to re-up the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, because we think they should, and we hope that they'll consider that. We're seeing great progress in Wisconsin, which is a ban state. In the Senate Health Committee, they unanimously voted to open a Kratom Consumer Protection Act bill. In Michigan, we're going to have a bill filed shortly as soon as they reconvene. We have bills filed in Illinois. In the state of West Virginia, there was a ban that came in late in their session within the last couple of days, and someone dropped in the ban from again at the FDA's instigation, and it took a parliamentary maneuver where the West Virginia Senate unanimously stripped the kratom out of their scheduling bill. So we make great progress, and I'll tell you one of the best examples, and I think this illustrates the most important thing about the kratom community. In the state of Maryland, the sponsor of the bill did meet with Dr. Henningfield and I, and we explained that he was wrong. And he said, well, I'm just stuck because I did this at the behest of a constituent, and I read the FDA stuff, and so, I'm just going to kind of pursue it, but I get it, and I think you're right. The next day, when we had the hearing, you saw a couple of dozen kratom consumers who stepped up to the microphone, and they told their passionate stories. At the end of that discussion, the sponsor of the bill, Senator Young, said, and it's on the record, you can see the videotape, he said, this has been a very compelling case. He said, and frankly, I'd like to try some kratom because I have bad arthritis in my knee. The Senate committee passed out the bill, the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. It went to the Senate floor. There was one amendment that they made to it, which was to reduce the age limit from 21 to 18, which is fine. It then went to the House Judiciary Committee, and again, a couple of dozen kratom consumers took the time to come to the state capitol for the second time and to speak loudly. And there we got a little more resistance, but in the end, it was clear that the KCPA was going to be the preferred bill. Now, unfortunately, they had to adjourn because of the COVID thing, and we didn't get our bill acted on in the House. We're going to be back next year. That story gets replicated in San Diego County, where it's a county of 3 million people, by the way, in California. They had a proposed ban. It was called they wanted to declare kratom a public nuisance because that's the way the law reads there, what they are allowed to do in the county.
Right.
Same scenario. Dozens of kratom consumers stepped to the microphone and told their story that kratom has saved their lives.
These
And
testimonies are really helping.
They are. And I cannot emphasize it enough that as we tell these stories and you see it over and over and over again, it moves these legislators and these members of the boards of supervisors. When we're able to get in front of them and tell our story, it is magnificent, and it makes a huge difference. I'll end with this. It's a great story. In the state of Utah last year, when the governor was going to sign the bill, they had a ceremonial bill signing, and it had overwhelming support in the Utah legislature. And he sat down, was about to sign the bill, and he said, "What is kratom?" Never heard of it, didn't know what it was.
Right.
And so I started to explain. Senator Bramble, who was our sponsor, explained a little bit to him. And he said, well, what is it used for? And there was a kratom consumer whom we'd invited to come. Her name is Laura Romney. And Laura told this incredible story about how she had, a couple of years before, had developed a very rare brain condition, which essentially caused her intense pain 24/7 to the point that she couldn't sleep, she couldn't function. And it was a problem where she had the equivalent of an intense ice cream headache from the top of her lip to the top of her head. They did 2 brain surgeries on her, neither of which was successful. And she was trapped in opioid use. And a friend of hers called her and said, "Have you tried this stuff called kratom?" She'd never heard of it. The friend brought her some. And this was what she told the governor. She said, "On the first day I took it, I felt immediate relief. What had been a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10 was down to the 2, and I could manage it. And it was from this natural product." And she said, "I don't have to take opioids anymore. I don't have to choose between whether I want to be a mother, whether I want to get some sleep, whether I want to be a wife, whether I want to be an employee." She said, "My life was restored to me." That was a powerful testimony. And so we see that story replicated over and over again when people come to the microphone and tell that story. I was struck by the passionate testimony of a veteran who told his story about how the VA, the Veterans Administration, had failed him. They had stuck him on these opioids, and he found kratom. And he essentially said to the San Diego Board of Supervisors, "If you ban kratom, you are giving me a death sentence."
Yeah.
And that's the bottom line. So we're in this battle because it's the right thing, because it's all about harm reduction, and it's because people have the right in this country to make their own choices about whether or not what they choose to use for their health and well-being.
Yes.
Now, there's a distinction between what vendors can do and what they can claim and all that, but the individual citizen has the right to make that decision, and the government should not get in between that right with these bogus claims that the FDA has done. And we hope that that's going to end when we're successful in our battle.
Well, Mac, I certainly appreciate your time. Also, in closing, I wanted to say, since you're a member of the Kingpin's Hideout group now, any way that I or anybody in the group or affiliated groups can help you, feel free to post there. Let us know. I'll do whatever I can. Kratom saved my life, and there's so many testimonies I've heard as well, and we can't have it taken away.
That's right. And I end with this one caution, and that is that everyone should understand that the FDA, among other regulatory activities that they engage in, they watch social media constantly, and kratom is on their hands. And so people should understand that what they say, and particularly vendors, need to understand that if they allow for any public comments on their websites where they're marketing a kratom product, where the consumer tells their story, that's a violation of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and the FDA can then come in and shut you down. So we want people to be responsible. Let's shrink the target that's on our back that the FDA uses consistently to try to go after us. Let's make sure that we're responsible not only in the way we market it, but let's make sure that we're responsible in the way we use it. And in doing that, we're going to preserve the safety of this product. We're going to be able to keep it legal, and we're going to be able to win the battle that we have from a regulatory policy standpoint and everything that we're working on. So I am proud to be a part of an army of people in the United States who are willing to stand up and tell the FDA they're wrong, to explain to state legislators what the right regulatory framework is. And I am glad to join your group because I want to be a part of any movement that encourages people, educates them, alerts them, and brings them into the army of people that we need in order to win this battle.
Yes, sir. Well, Mac, I certainly appreciate your time. I thank you for coming on the show. What you had to say was very educational, and we really appreciate it.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much, and thank you for leading this battle here among your group in order to get this information out.
It's no problem. Kratom saves lives, y'all. Well, I certainly appreciate you, Mac.
Hey, my pleasure. Thank you for taking the time. Let me do my thing.
Yep, you did it well. Thank you, sir.
All right. Thanks.
Talk to you later.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. Hey guys, okay, that was Mac Haddow of the American Kratom Association. Everybody heard what we need to do. We need to come hard with them testimonies. Get with your local legislators. And also, anybody that's a vendor, we got to be careful about what we say. As is with myself. So, man, I'm really glad everybody showed up to check this out. Please share this everywhere. I mean, he told the whole story, y'all. That was really awesome. I had no idea some of the things that he actually just told me. Like he explained the whole thing. And pretty much the FDA is overstepping their bounds. We got to step up. We got to represent. If you want to donate to the American Kratom Association, you just click that box that was right next to Mac. He's already hung up, but I am still here if anybody wants to talk about anything. Any comments or anything like that? Man, I want to take a road trip. Man, I just want to spread awareness because, Kratom saved my life. And I just want other people to have the same opportunity to hear the gospel of Kratom. I mean, look, Kratom is. I know what he said about medical claims. This is an act of satire. I have an IQ of -5, so take what I say with a grain of salt. I mean, come on, y'all. All the people that's got off opiates and everything. Is that a coincidence? And like Max said, we need science. And apparently we do have scientists that are backing up the claims that we make that are true. So, but yeah, that was pretty freaking awesome. I was kind of nervous. I'm going to be honest, y'all. I had to take a big scoop of chill nerd before I did this. And then I took another scoop right when I started. So, yeah. Anyway, y'all, if y'all need anything at all from me, the Kratom Kingpin, y'all can just send me an instant message from my business page. If y'all need to talk, need somebody to talk to, whatever, or if you need some Kratom, whatever, y'all know how to get in contact with me. God bless all y'all. And you know what, Heather? You are right. The FDA needs some Kratom. And you know what? They probably take Kratom too, but the thing is, like Max said, they're addicted to the money. Thank you, Heather. Yeah, they're like they're probably like, oh yeah, Kratom. kratom's bad. This kratom's destroying lives. We got to get off the market, y'all. Hold on 1 second. Yeah. Okay, I'm back. Yeah, kratom is destroying lives, y'all. We must stop it. Mm. And it looks like everybody is watching from Mitra Mike's page. If you did comment on the Kingpin page, I do apologize. Let me check that out right now, actually. I want to make sure that I didn't miss anybody. I'd feel terrible. Yes, sir, Dakota, I am live. I think you're already watching, though, brother. Oh, that was really awesome. Thanks, everybody, for showing up. I'm going to go ahead and end the broadcast. And thank you, everybody, for the compliments. Looks like the only thing we can do, stay home, stay safe, pray for our country, the situation, and that our God given rights are not trampled on and not stopped. Prayer works, y'all. I don't care what religion y'all are. Pray. Pray on it. We're going to see kratom legal one of these days very soon, y'all. I'm going to be keeping up with this. Anything that you want to share to do with the American Kratom Association or Kratom advocacy, anything I can do, y'all let me know. I'm on the Kingpin's Hideout page under Grace Warren right now. Until my Facebook ban's over. After my ban's over, I'm not going to be able to advertise my own kratom, which is fire. You can ask any of the people in here that's tried it. You already know I got fire. Anyway, thank y'all. God bless y'all. And I'm going to go ahead and end this live. Y'all have a good rest of y'all's Easter.